he shits himself. I don't think we need... Can we even watch this? I mean, it was 5 days ago. There's no way we can't, right? So, you clearly know what's happening right now, right? We have, obviously, probably the best player in classic World of Warcraft right here. And he's fighting this monster. It's obvious what's happening. And he died. It's obvious that he died. It's obvious that he died.
More than that happened, buddy!
Wow, apparently.
Buddy, more than that happens!
Looks like the guy might have...
Let's time travel back to the 2000s. This was the era of Shrek, MySpace, Linkin Park, the iPod, annoying pop-ups. That weird frog ringtone thing.
Ding 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 ding.
Nokia flip phones, SpongeBob, David Beckham, and of course, Bushisms.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
During this time, the genre of fantasy was having a renaissance with the likes of the Harry Potter books. First of which was the Philosopher's Stone, or in the American version, the Sorcerer's Stone, dating back to 1997, which, as we all know, became a huge hit, followed by 6 more books and 8 movies, along with offshoots. The Harry Potter universe was extremely popular, primarily with teenage girls and young women. The setting of this universe is known as low fantasy, meaning that the magical elements exist in our modern, normal world. To my knowledge, talking hats do not exist in the real world. Maybe they exist in the UK. Any Brits, please enlighten me if they do indeed exist. The early 2000s saw the Lord of the Rings trilogy based off of Tolkien's novels from the 1950s as well. They dominated the Oscars and the box office for 3 straight years, forming a massive following and a resurgence of the franchise, particularly among young men. The setting of these movies takes place in the realm of Middle-earth, a prehistoric, mythological continent during a period of Earth's supposed past, emphasis on the word supposed. Middle-earth is meant to still be on our planet Earth, but in a sort of past age, long before the first recorded civilizations of ancient history. While still on Earth, Middle-earth is a fictional version of our own universe called Arda. Confusing, I know. As a result of this style of world building, we have a setting inspired by, yet vastly different than our own real world. Because of its vast differences with Earth, Lord of the Rings is considered what we call high fantasy by most fans and scholars of literature. High fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy set in an imagined world other than our own. While Lord of the Rings is usually considered the most famous high fantasy, Tolkien's claims that Middle-earth is meant to be part of our Earth's past make the claim of high fantasy up for debate. The Chronicles of Narnia were also released a few years later, starting in 2005, based off of the books written by C.S. Lewis. This belongs to the subgenre called portal fantasy, as the real world of 1940s Britain is interconnected to the high fantasy world of Narnia through a wardrobe out of all places. There were other high-profile fantasy franchises during the 2000s, in publishing, filming, and video games, such as the dark high fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire, which would come into far greater prominence in the following decade with the TV series A Game of Thrones, along with other series like A Wheel of Time, also based off of a series of novels. The Legend of Zelda games such as Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, based in the high fantasy setting known as Hyrule, came out on the Nintendo 64 and GameCube around the same time as the Lord of the Rings movies. While not as prominent as Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings, another major fantasy franchise at that time was Warcraft. In fact, Warcraft dates back a little further, all the way to 1994 with its first game, Warcraft 1: Orcs and Humans. It was a real-time strategy game. It was quite simplistic and was heavily inspired by, you guessed it, Lord of the Rings, as well as Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop game which dominated the 1980s. Warcraft 1 was followed by, you guessed it, Warcraft 2, very original name, in 1996, and Warcraft 3 in 2002. As the franchise progressed, the lore became ever more expansive and detailed on the planet of Azeroth, as well as other cosmic realms illustrated in various stories. The early 2000s were a golden age of real-time strategy games, with games like Red Alert 2, Age of Mythology, and Command & Conquer Generals. However, the genre would decline in popularity and would quickly be replaced with the massive multiplayer online role-playing games, also known as MMORPGs to use the acronym, or initialism. RuneScape would be the lead MMORPG in 2001, first as an internet browser game, followed by the South Korean game Priston Tale. And yes, there was even Club Penguin. These games were groundbreaking at the time, hosting thousands of players in the same digital space, a feat unthinkable just a few years prior. Meanwhile, a game designer by the name of Chris Metzen, who was heavily inspired by the aesthetics, world building, and game mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, namely the shared universe of Dragonlace, would be working on his magnum opus. Speaking of that magnum opus, in 2004, a new MMORPG would take the world by storm by teleporting millions upon millions of people into a fictional world. That fictional world would be the aforementioned planet of Azeroth in the world of Warcraft.
Beyond the gates of mighty kingdoms lies a vast, unexplored world. A world of honor. A world of mystery. A world of danger. Warcraft.
Now keep in mind that the purpose of this video is not to cover the lore of this game. I doubt a video about the history of some random Murloc tribe would inspire that much interest. Nor am I going to cover the development of the game mechanics, or what type of coffee machines they had at the Blizzard office. What this video is actually about is how the fictional world of Azeroth was inspired by our real world, as well as other fictional worlds, and how this fictional world of Azeroth impacted our real world. On November 23rd, 2004, the portal to this new world would be opened, just in time for the Christmas spree buying bonanza. And like all big Christmas gifts, it instantly became a huge hit and a cultural phenomenon. Yes, this game came out over 20 years ago, and people are still playing it. Feel old yet? I'm still a young adult, and just recognizing that fact makes me feel like I belong in a retirement home playing bingo while I'm hooked up to a dialysis. When the servers opened up just in time for Christmas in 2004, the players were astounded by the scale of the game. This was a world that was, albeit much smaller in scale than our own world for obvious logistical time management and gameplay reasons, but nonetheless was massive by the standards of video games at the time. The entire gaming area in vanilla World of Warcraft was roughly the size of 1.5 Manhattans. A global imagination on the scale of digital neighborhoods, which made gameplay feasible. Traveling across continents in a wooden sailship would take months, and not even the most devoted gamer addict neckbeard has time for that. Thankfully, it seems so much bigger than it actually was, as the game was stretched out over 2 continents, 40 zones, 6 major cities, along with dungeons and raids. And with the exception of those dungeons, raids, and other forms of instances, along with the travel between 2 continents, there were no loading screens. The relative lack of loading screens created a sense of interconnection between various disparate parts of the world. The world of Azeroth is a world of high fantasy, a separate world that does not obey the laws of physics. To my knowledge, there is no way to scientifically transform people I hate into sheep for 45 seconds. If there was, I'd do it all the time. The world of Azeroth is more high fantasy than nearly all previous franchises I mentioned. But the whole universe is fictional rather than being a fictional part of our world, such as Middle-earth, or more accurately, a fictional part of our past world. But given that the world of Warcraft was created by people on the world of Earth, this game has always had plenty of real-life inspiration from our planet, at least in the zones which aren't overtly whimsical. There are desolate arid canyons, lush tropical rainforests, bustling cityscapes, and agrarian breadbaskets. Some are loosely inspired, others are heavily inspired by real-life locations. For example, the Zone of 1,000 Needles is clearly inspired by the American state of Utah, with pillars of rock that resemble the Arches National Park, as well as the Salt Flat, which is based off of the Bonneville Salt Flat in, you guessed it, Utah. And like the Salt Flats in Utah, there's even a gigantic racetrack testing the fastest vehicles on Earth. Granted, the vehicles in our world are not built by gnomes and goblins. Other zones were more fantastical, with a mix of high fantasy, steampunk, sci-fi, horror, along with real-world legends, mythology, and folklore of countless cultures around the globe. Many cultures in the game are heavily based off of the cultures of Earth, such as the humans being loosely based off of medieval England, similar to that of Lord of the Rings. The Tauren were arguably based off of the noble savage trope of Native Americans. The dwarves had more of a Celtic inspiration. And the trolls have more of an Afro-Caribbean vibe, given their love of the voodoo religion that can be found in Haiti, as well as their Jamaican accents.
The way to a man's heart be through his stomach, but I go through the rib cage.
Oh yeah, and the trolls also have a lot of Mesoamerican architecture, similar to the Mayans and Aztecs, showing us that the game designers weren't really trying to completely mimic real-world cultures, but actually mix and match existing cultures into unique fictional cultures. Using real-world cultures as inspiration for fictional cultures has always been a thorny issue, especially during the 2010s, as some franchises such as Lord of the Rings were criticized for quote-unquote Eurocentrism. Granted, others saw these controversies as a bogus set of attempts to force identity politics into a fictional world where they supposedly did not belong. I personally love real-world inspiration, even if they are simplifications of real-world cultures. To expect a video game to portray the complexities of the Lakota tribe in the form of a Minotaur character from Greek mythology is, well, pun intended, bullshit. Although there is one area where the stereotyping can be a little bit quote-unquote problematic. The goblins in World of Warcraft have New York accents, hook-shaped noses, and constantly obsess about money. Well, putting alleged stereotypes aside, I have to give the game developers a great deal of credit for the immense amount of interest and inspiration they took from the real world. Be it their cultures, mythologies, folklore, histories, and geographies. There is even a statue in Booty Bay of a goblin spreading out his arms, similar to the statue of Jesus in Rio de Janeiro. It makes sense since Jesus was a Jew, although I'm pretty sure goblins are not Brazilian. The world of Warcraft was also rich with countless quests, NPCs, mobs, bosses, critters, scenery, pop culture references, and Easter eggs. The attention to detail was just astounding. You could perform a quest in a city to send a message to the original NPC's cousin on the other side of the planet in the middle of a desert. Putting the scale and scope of the world aside, the other element of the world that was just as, if not more important, was the social dynamic. Sure, multiplayer games existed before. You could always play Mario Kart 64 with 4 controllers. The earlier MMORPGs were big, but not as expansive. The social nature of the game required group cohesion and planning to achieve difficult tasks that were not possible in older games. One viral incident was that of Leeroy Jenkins.
Percentage of survival.
Oh, it's a lot better than we usually do.
Alright, chums up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leeroy Jenkins!
Oh my god, he just ran in. Save him!
Oh, geez, stick to the plane.
Oh Jesus! Let's go! Stick to the pledge,
Stick to the plane.
Oh gee,
This involved a man by the name of Ben Schultz, who broke his group's thoroughly planned strategy in a raid, and just ran into the enemy mob screaming his own character's name. The video was uploaded in 2005 before YouTube was bought by Google, making it one of those classic viral clips of the 2000s, showing the cultural power not only of World of Warcraft, but even more so, YouTube. Check out my video on early YouTube to learn more. Leeroy eventually became an NPC in the game, and was even parodied in a Family Guy episode, as well as mentioned on The Daily Show. Ben Schultz even got his own appearance at BlizzCon. One of the first big events in the World of Warcraft that got a lot of attention from normies was the Corrupted Blood incident. During the autumn of 2005, there was a new raid in the jungle zone of Stranglethorn Vale called Zul'Gurub, a troll city heavily inspired by the architecture and religion of the Mayans, Aztecs, and other Mesoamerican pre-Columbian cultures. Keep in mind that the raid was meant exclusively for very high-level players. At the end of the raid, the boss Hakar the Soul Flarer would be your final opponent, and he would cast what in WoW is known as a debuff, but in the wider video game industry is usually known as a status effect, which would infect the player's character with a pathogen, which would slowly lower their hit points. On top of that, being in close proximity with a character that was already infected would in turn infect your character, like a contagious pathogen in the real world. The raid was an instance, as the game developers assumed that the disease would be removed once the players left the instance. However, the game developers forgot that the Hunter class players had pet beasts which would help them in fighting, and those pets could get infected during the gameplay. They forgot to remove the debuff from those pets. And when these hunter characters exited the instance with their infected pets, the pathogen spread. Now keep in mind that pandemics in the real world are oftentimes zoonotic, meaning that they are derived from animals such as the bird flu, smallpox, SARS, Ebola, and even more recently the coof. It turned out that this pandemic in the World of Warcraft was also zoonotic. When these players and their pets entered the non-instance realms of the World of Warcraft, the corrupted blood disease spread like influenza. Like with real-world pandemics, the hardest hit areas were major metropolitan centers, as you have a whole bunch of people interacting with each other all the time. This was the case with Hong Kong during the SARS pandemic, as well as New York City during the more recent coof. While cities like Ironforge and Orgrimmar were littered with the skeletons of dead player characters, many other characters sought refuge in rural areas, out in nature, escaping the hustle and bustle of the big cities and the death that it brought about. In these major cities, the heaviest hit players were low-level players. After all, the debuff was meant to only hit high players in the raid. This is similar to how pandemics hit the elderly, infants, and people with pre-existing conditions the hardest, as their immune systems, or in this case HP, is the weakest. The Corrupted Blood incident truly was an international pandemic as far as the nations of Azeroth were concerned. It was so widespread that some players even seemed to develop conspiracy theories similar to those of real-life pandemics. The pandemic showed the best and worst of the player base. Some priest players specialized in healing and would dedicate their time to healing the characters of other players, similar to doctors and nurses during real-life pandemic outbreaks. On the other side of the spectrum, there were players who supposedly infected other players for shits and giggles. Eventually, the game developers would set up quarantine zones for the players. Many of these peaceful measures just really didn't work in the long term though. What ended up fixing the problem was a hard reset, or more accurately, a variety of hard resets, which made the pets immune from the disease debuff. Eventually, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, based in Atlanta, Georgia, would eventually work with Blizzard to study the incident. The Journal of Epistemology produced a peer-reviewed paper of the incident as well, comparing it to the avian flu. Now, while the corrupted blood incident was very valuable for the understanding of human social psychology and the spread of disease, the analogy eventually fell apart, as all analogies do. In the World of Warcraft, players who die in the game can turn into ghosts next to the nearest graveyard and then walk to their corpse. Well, walk to the corpse of the character and then resurrect. This meant that players kept coming back to life, prolonging the pandemic, rather than having it die down as real-world pandemics do once they kill off segments of the population which are too weak and lack immunity. Moving on to the next subject. Speaking of characters dying, there were several different types of servers in the game. You had player versus player, player versus environment, and role-playing servers. Player versus player allowed members of two different factions, the Horde and the Alliance, to fight each other in an open world, as opposed to only fighting each other in instance battlegrounds. Player versus environment servers had more of a relaxed environment, in which you could wave and dance in front of enemy players in the open world, and battles between the two factions were relegated to those aforementioned battlegrounds. However, you couldn't really communicate with them as the Horde and the Alliance spoke different languages. Even though each set of players would type in English or whatever other language the server would be based upon, Portuguese, French, etc., eventually what would come out would be gibberish according to the other side. For example, when Horde players type LOL in English, short for laughing out loud, the Alliance players would see kek displayed. For those of you who don't know, kek is an onomatopoeia of ha 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 or he 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 for Koreans, and South Korea was one of the biggest player bases for another Blizzard game, StarCraft, and you would oftentimes see kek in the dialogue between different players when they were playing competitively, and so the Blizzard game developers probably added kek on purpose. Kek would later be immortalized again on the internet as a reference to the ancient Egyptian frog god and controversial meme Pepe the Frog. Keep in mind that chat moderation was moderated more strictly in World of Warcraft than it had been on other gaming platforms such as Battle.net. Insulting and harassing people would get you penalized, and as a result of this, there were less your mom jokes in WoW chats. Instead, you got a lot more cordial social interactions that involved lighthearted humor, such as the now dated Chuck Norris jokes in the Barons chats. Yeah, for some reason, a zone inspired by the African savanna with zebras and giraffes being hunted by orcs had a bunch of teenagers telling overused jokes about a 90s TV star. Meanwhile, role-playing servers were the least populated but had the most devout player base. These players would walk, not run in cities. They'd have fantasy-inspired names, complex personalities, and a whole lore universe for each and every individual player. I personally would love to roleplay on World of Warcraft, but I would only do it if my lifespan was multiplied by a factor of 10 and I wouldn't need to sleep. Otherwise, I really just don't have the time for it. Now, regardless of what server a player was on, there was a digital planet of social interaction to varying degrees. WoW was kind of like a social media platform at a time when YouTube, let alone Instagram, didn't exist. People joined groups to complete quests, and many started guilds. Guilds could form randomly, or they could be based upon class, fictional race, character gender, and other characteristics similar to what you'd see with meetup groups. And like meetup groups, sometimes these guilds raided enemy towns, and sometimes they entered actual raids, and sometimes they just had drunken parties. Speaking of alcohol, you could even drink alcohol in the game at taverns and at fairs. It did indeed make the screen look blurry. After the drunken festivities, some people even went to Goldshire Inn's bedrooms and engaged in activities that didn't exactly fit in with the terms of service. Through the gameplay, many people would form friendships and even a handful of romantic relationships. Mock weddings and other celebrations were common in the early days, especially during holiday events that Blizzard would put on for Christmas, Halloween, and a variety of other actual real-world holidays that were modified for a fantasy setting. I remember jokingly getting my character married at Stormwind's Chapel with a friend's character and buying a cheap ring. While most of the female characters in the game were played by men, some were played by women, and there would eventually be some rare instances of genuine relationships being formed through the game. I remember having a high school friend who claimed to fall in love with a girl he met on World of Warcraft. She was in the UK, and they planned on meeting each other in person, but nothing really came about of it beyond some foreplay in one of the taverns. Our friend group endlessly made fun of him for it. This phenomenon was also mocked in the Onion article titled, quote, "Baby, you mean the World of Warcraft to me," with a picture of a guy you'd assume to be a typical World of Warcraft player, at least in the aesthetic sense. My favorite passage was, quote, "Helen, my mage, when I was ganked by a lowly rogue from Tennessee in the caverns of time and stripped of my treasured belongings, I rose from the grave with one purpose in mind. I had been resurrected not to seek revenge, but to return to you. There is no other way to put it. You take my breath bar away. Why do we need to go out and have fun? Everything we could possibly want is right here in World of Warcraft. Fine dining, theater, romantic sunsets, they're all there. The outside world just costs money. And I don't have the magic breastplates to protect me from other people's stares. Now come with me, so I can treat you like the princess you are." Now this leads us to the next topic, which is the real-world stigma that emerged against World of Warcraft players. While WoW was renowned for its escapism, immersive nature, its quasi-social interaction, and the never-ending amount of content to play, even after one had reached the max level of 60 at the time, there had still nonetheless been a little bit of an ick factor. In most games, once you reach the max level, you just give up. Hey, you finished it. But once you were the max level in World of Warcraft, it opened up whole new chapters of gameplay to enjoy. The flip side of this is that the game became a lowercase quote-unquote addiction for a minority of players. The endless grinds, daily quests, drive to get better and better gear and impress your semi-friends led to more people to rot themselves away in their gamer chairs, guzzling Pepsi, shoveling nacho chips down their gullets, and confusing physical movements of their characters for their own physical exercise requirements. Alas, moving the mouse and pressing the F key don't count as sufficient cardio. The worst example of this was the Winter Spring Frost Saber mount quests, which required around 12 hours of grinding the most boring gameplay in order to pursue a purple cat with the complexion of a Starbucks unicorn frappuccino, so you can in turn show off to all the other gamers how meaningless your life is. There was even a viral news story in Australia at the time of a teenage boy who had spent 16 hours a day playing the game.
teenager hooked on violent computer games. He's playing them an incredible 16 hours a day. His mother says his personality has changed and that he's become moody and violent, and his addiction is tearing the family apart.
They don't realise how addictive it can be.
It's a world of fantasy and fun. But for 16-year-old Cameron Sandler, this is more than a game. It's an addiction and an illness.
I am addicted to the game, but I'm not fully addicted. Like, I can quit whenever I want. This really kicks ass, doesn't it?
It all started 18 months ago when Cameron discovered World of Warcraft.
Oh, now I'm going to kill you all.
This never-ending computer game is played by millions around the globe.
From America, Germany, China, all of Europe, England.
And you've got friends in all of these places?
Yeah.
And that's what you refer to them as, your friends?
Yeah.
Someone should have told his mother that there's a very simple solution to this problem. It's called uninstalling the game, changing his passwords, and letting him go outside to enjoy the end of his addiction cold turkey. No longer could he kill any pixelated demons or boars. Type World of Warcraft into Urban Dictionary and you will get definitions like, quote, crack in a CD-ROM, a good fun alternative to life, and my personal fave, the world's most effective form of birth control. The example given is pregnancy, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and herpes. These are some of the things that World of Warcraft players need not be concerned about. By far, the most famous example of this was the South Park episode, Make Love Not Warcraft. The episode covers Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman, along with Stan's dad, through their journey of getting addicted to the game. The episode covers the captivating role-playing contrasted with the boring reality of life.
Randy, you working on that sediment analysis?
Not now, Nelson. I just joined a big party of night elves and we're going to explore the Tower of Azeroth together.
Is that a computer game?
No, Artard. It's an MMORPG. These are real people I'm playing with, see? I'm a hunter, level 2. I can chat with all these other people. I can even wave to this guy, see? Hello. In the outside world, I am a simple geologist. But in here, I am Falcorn, defender of the Alliance. I've braved the Fargo Deep Mine, defeated the Bloodfish at Jared's Landing.
Looks like that guy just killed you.
What? Why? Why?
The boys eventually have to defeat a player who has spent every moment of his life since the game came out playing World of Warcraft. In order to defeat the enemy player, the boys become neckbeard gamer addicts by spending countless hours killing low-level boars. The plot doesn't really fit in with the game mechanics, but it does brilliantly satirize the excesses of some of the player base.
Oh god, I'm gonna have diarrhea again. You can't go to the bathroom, you're stacking Sunder armor. It's okay. Mom! Bathroom!
What, hon?
Bathroom! Bathroom!
Oh, that's a big boy, isn't he?
During the 2013 BlizzCon cosplay competition, a man by the name of Jared Naden cosplayed not as a warlock or paladin, but rather as the neckbeard from the South Park episode, a true legend. The game developers were totally self-aware of the addictive nature of the game. The game would usually have tips on their loading screens regarding gameplay. However, there was one tip that stood out, saying, quote, "Tip, bring your friends to Azeroth, but don't forget to go outside of Azeroth with them as well." Now, for any Zoomers watching this, keep in mind that as millennials were teenagers during the 2000s, gaming was still rather stigmatized. It was oftentimes looked down upon as a waste of time that could be better spent on lame stuff like playing sports, meeting friends, and God forbid even getting laid. which you Zoomers almost never do apparently. See, it wasn't until the 2010s when gaming, tech, and geek culture lost its stigma. While these stereotypes were, for the most part, jock, douche bro, sports fan, meathead nonsense, the behavior of some of these gamers, namely World of Warcraft players, didn't really help discard the otherwise unfair reputation of the hobby. However, with the massive popularity of World of Warcraft and other games, along with the immersive power of the tech industry, geek culture would eventually win. In the 1984 movie Revenge of the Nerds, you have a plot which involves a bunch of computer geeks defeating a bunch of frat jocks and winning over the girls. I suppose the movie was prophetic given the mass popularity of computers, video games, and speculative fiction, to the point that even competitive gamers get some poontang. What was considered uncool became cool, and while a lot of WoW addicts weren't cool at all, the game was really, really cool nonetheless. The game's reputation would rebound as many celebrities came out as major fans, such as Mr. T, William Shatner, Vin Diesel, and the late great Robin Williams. Shatner and Mr. T would show up in a series of WoW ads alongside Jean-Claude Van Damme in the French ads.
Some suckers think my night elf mohawk is a hoax, like jackalopes or the moon landing. Well, it ain't. So I'm hunting them down with my latest invention, the Mohawk Grenade. Yeah, wherever I go, I'm making Warcraft look good. So don't give me no back talk. Try World of Warcraft free at warcraft.com.
Find a night elf mohawk in-game and claim your Mohawk grenades.
Rated T for teen. I'm Mr. T and I'm a night elf mohawk. What's your game?
Other celebrities would include Steve Van Zandt from Bruce Springsteen's band, as well as Ozzy Osbourne. My personal favorite quasi-celebrity to express his love for the game is George, quote-unquote, Corpse Grinder Fisher, from the death metal band Cannibal Corpse. While his music, if you could call it that, is incomprehensible grunting about graphic violence, his interview about World of Warcraft showed a softer side.
What do you do on your years off? You just relax, or?
Yeah, I'll spend time with my daughters, wife and daughters, go to Disney, do some fishing, grilling, watching American football, drinking, playing World of Warcraft. That's one of my, that's my passion there.
In 2013, the game would undergo another controversy. Whistleblower Edward Snowden, with the help of journalist Glenn Greenwald, would expose a massive spying campaign by the Five Eyes program. This was an alliance of shared intelligence between 5 major Anglophone nations, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These revelations, if you could call them that, were groundbreaking at the time. One could expect mass surveillance in Russia or Iran, but it was another matter to acknowledge that it was happening in open, pluralistic, liberal democracies. While much of the surveillance was covering metadata on emails, it turns out that the US National Security Agency, also known as the NSA, along with the British Government Communications HQ, were spying on World of Warcraft players within the World of Warcraft, along with other games such as Second Life and Xbox Live Chat. Now, to be fair, organized crime did sometimes use Second Life as a form of communication. However, this became much more controversial when it turned out that intelligence services were spying on guilds. Imagine joining a guild to kill the Lich King, only to find out that some of your brothers in arms were actually NSA agents worried that you might be allying with the Taliban. Granted, this didn't amount to much. Maybe the invasion of Ukraine would have worked better if Putin hired some night elves to promote pro-Kremlin talking points in the game. The game nonetheless continued to be very popular in spite of the stigma, with merchandise like video games, trading cards, figurines, novels, comic books, and supplementary games such as Hearthstone and Heroes of the Storm, not to mention over 10 expansions, adding ever more gameplay, lore, and merch. On top of all of this, there were large online communities for World of Warcraft on forums and on Reddit. There were a variety of YouTube channels dedicated to covering the lore and gameplay. In 2016, the Warcraft movie would be released in theaters based off of the events of Warcraft 1. Many thought this would help the game get more mainstream popularity and break what some called the video game movie curse. For those of you who don't know, the video game movie curse was the concept that movies based off of video games were doomed to fail at the box office, and generally speaking, lacked any artistic merit. Many fans and critics believed that Blizzard could break through the video game movie curse. After all, Duncan Jones got hired to direct, and Travis Miller from the Vikings was made the main star. Nonetheless, the movie didn't even break even after marketing distribution. Despite large-scale viewership in China, the movie was for the most part panned by critics. The video game movie curse was not broken. In fact, it would actually be broken by the Sonic the Hedgehog film. Yes, a fictional world with a library of lore got beaten out by a speedy blue hedgehog and Jim Carrey. Nonetheless, the escapism of the world continued to suck in so many new players, despite some of the newer games surpassing WoW in playership and technical specifications. One of the largest markets for the game was and still is China, with a massive population which is getting more and more digitized, wealthier, and urbanized. Young Chinese men would become one of the biggest fan bases for the game. This was to the point in which Blizzard had to create updated models for undead characters and mobs, to not show bones, as showing bones is taboo in Chinese culture and would not pass the Chinese Communist Party's censors. Blizzard was one of many Western companies alongside Disney, the NBA, and others, which had to walk a tightrope between their art and appeasing Chinese censorship for greater market appeal. One example of World of Warcraft's immense influence in China was its expansion Mists of Pandaria, which is heavily based off of Chinese culture, namely its history, mythology, and folklore. Given the fact that it is centered around humanoid pandas, and pandas are, well, from China, this capitalized off of the Chinese market. Keep in mind that the only reference to Pandarians in the previous Warcraft games was a very minor character called the Pandarian Brewmaster from Warcraft 3, along with some hidden mobs. This was essentially a bonus character that only some players had familiarity with. They took this one little side character and turned him into an entire expansion, which eventually turned out to be really good. The expansion was praised widely by critics and players despite kind of being a joke. I believe that part of what captivated people about this universe so much was the ability to mix very dark existential threats with more fun-loving silly aspects that made the world all the more diverse and deep. Not in some philosophical sense, but in the sense of just how complex and multifaceted it was. Going back to the subject of China, in 2023 the partnership between Blizzard and NetEase fell apart after nearly 15 years, namely over intellectual property and licensing issues. Keep in mind that intellectual property has always been a stickler point between China and many developed nations such as the United States, Japan, Italy, etc. This led to the game being shut down for around a year in the country. In 2024, when Microsoft bought Activision Blizzard, the dispute was resolved, and WoW returned to China. Some praised the deal as a rational business model, while others criticized it for kowtowing to the Chinese government, since companies in China are so interwoven with the government under the CCP's state capitalist system. Speaking of capitalism, the economy in World of Warcraft was also interconnected with the economy of the real world, both in the United States, China, and other nations. Under the game's economy, 100 copper coins equals 1 silver coin, and 100 silver coins equals 1 gold coin. While 1 WoW gold coin is worth far less than a US dollar, it is actually worth more than a handful of real-world currencies, under regimes which are so incompetent that they've created mass deflation. One example is Zimbabwe's currency with its trillion unit bills. Another example is the Venezuelan bolivar. Keep in mind that a WoW gold coin is worth anywhere between 7 to 30 times the value of Venezuela's currency. Investing in World of Warcraft gold is a smarter investment than, say, the Iranian rial. Speaking of monetary policy and corruption, this WoW gold would become valuable enough to prompt the start of what is now known as gold farming. Players from primarily developing countries would grind endlessly to get gold and then sell their gold to players in rich countries, or in some cases, rich people in their own country. The nexus of gold farming was at first China, which at the time was wealthy enough for widespread internet use but still had widespread urban poverty. Back in the 2000s, internet cafes were common before the near ubiquitous use of the internet. There were stores that were oftentimes referred to as game sweatshops. While the gamers themselves were paid very little for extracting the gold from grinding, the Chinese owners of the cafes had created a very lucrative business model. The overall controversy is another example of the sharp class divide between rich Chinese urbanites and the poor newcomers coming from rural areas. To be fair to these business owners, killing vultures in a video game to extract gold seems a lot easier than extracting actual real gold in a gold mine. There were also controversies over purchasing accounts with pre-existing characters as well as items. In the real world, there are consignment stores which sell used luxury items. What's weird about consignment stores is that part of the status of, say, having a Gucci bag or a Rolex watch is that they're exclusive, and anybody wearing them is presumably wearing a new one, not a used one sold for the fraction of the price. It is one thing when you trick another luxury brand obsessed douchebag into thinking that the $200 wallet you bought from the consignment store was actually a new mint condition Mont Blanc wallet bought from the actual store for $600. But it is another matter when you try to impress your gamer neckbeard friends that the flaming pixelated sword you wield didn't come from buying it online through real money transfers through WoW Gold, but rather came from slaying a fictional lava elemental demigod. Slaying a fictional lava elemental god is a lot cooler than buying some flaming sword from some Chinese guy. Now, Blizzard settled the issue by quote-unquote soul-binding valuable armor and weapons to characters. This is fantasy speak for allowing one character to wear a specific dropped item. Imagine if you bought a used Rolex watch at a fraction of the price only to have that watch shock you whenever you wear it. Several years later, the world of Warcraft would be hit with new threats, not from undead or demonic armies, but rather from real-world issues. In 2021, Blizzard would be hit with accusations of harassment and misconduct against female employees, as well as fostering a culture of a fraternity. Some employees staged a walkout along with a class action lawsuit. To some, this was proof of widespread misogyny and discrimination, but to others, it was a sign of Me Too hysteria and the excesses of hypersensitive HR culture. Keep in mind that this was at the height of what some called cancel culture during 2021. While this became an overused buzzword, cancel culture refers to the moral panic of 2020 and 2021, in which many public and private figures were subject to various accusations of misconduct and bigotry. By 2022, there was a widespread cultural backlash to the excesses of the 2010s and the early 2020s. Warcraft, for the most part, managed to avoid the over-politicization of many franchises. Azeroth was a safe haven from all the mind-numbing brain rot of real-life culture wars. Granted, Blizzard itself was not let off the hook completely, as it continued to garner a negative reputation due to attempts by employees to unionize, as well as the perceived decline in quality. Expansions like Warlords of Draenor, Battle for Azeroth, and most of all Shadowlands were widely disliked by critics to varying degrees. To be fair, More recent examples like Dragonflight and The War Within have improved the quality of the game. Now keep in mind that the transition between the 2000s to the 2010s saw a transition between monoculture to polyculture. A monoculture is a culture in which everybody is listening to the same sort of music, watching the same sort of movies, playing the same sort of games, and reading the same sort of books. With a polyculture, you have a diversified culture. Poly meaning many. This leads to an oversaturation in large part due to digital platforms and social media. The culture becomes so dispersed that it's really hard to think of it as one cohesive culture. Under this circumstance, WoW is still incredibly popular, but it's not in the spotlight as it was in 2004, and probably will never be in the spotlight again. After all, there probably isn't one spotlight for gaming or any other medium at this point, given how fractured our culture has become. What is so remarkable about WoW is its longevity. Very few games last over 2 decades, and that in and of itself is amazing in spite of all the flaws. Now we're approaching the current day, so before I wrap this up, let me introduce you to a concept called identity tourism. Have you ever met somebody who obsesses over talking about their travel plans and experiences to the point where it just becomes insufferable? Well, that applies to me. I'm a frequent traveler. I've traveled along 6 different continents and across countless countries, and in many ways, for many of us in this category, as insufferable as it might be, travel ends up becoming part of our personality. It's a symbol of ourselves that subscribes us to high levels of extroversion and openness to new experiences, good or bad. While the term identity tourism was first applied to explorers and later people who like to backpack around Southeast Asia, it has more recently been applied to digital spaces such as MMORPGs. If one cannot afford to travel the real world, you can always travel virtual worlds. Speaking of those virtual worlds and the stories they tell, one of my favorite books is called The Storytelling Animal by evolutionary psychologist Jonathan Gottschall. The book covers why us humans create stories and new worlds to find our place in the real world. The final chapter of the book actually mentions the world of Warcraft, stating, take for example, Blizzard Entertainment's MMORPG World of Warcraft. It is hard to describe WoW in this compact space. For the same reason, it would be difficult to sum up the physical and cultural concept of Nicaragua or Norway in a few paragraphs. The ambition of World of Warcraft is startling, as developers aren't game makers, they're world makers. They tellingly refer to their creation not as a role-playing game, but as a role-playing experience. WoW's designers are geek gods, carving a virtual world out of the void. WoW is an online universe made up of many separate planets, races, factions, cultures, religions, and mutually incomprehensible languages. 12 million real people adventure there, meaning that the population of WoW's world exceeds that of Nicaragua and Norway's put together. The sociologist William Sims Bainbridge, who spent 2 years in World of Warcraft doing participant observation research, isn't exaggerating when he writes that WoW's experience is based off of a tapestry of mythology as complex as any in the ancient sagas. There are books lying around WoW's world, such as The New Horde and The Civil War in the Plaguelands, which your character can read to learn the lore of the realm. There is a series of novels stretching to 15 at this writing that flesh out WoW's backstory, development, the major characters, the constraints of the continuous evolution of online experiences, etc. When you enter WoW's world, you become a character in an evolving epic that stretches back to the beginning of time, the first gods, the birth of worlds, and 10,000 years of history, charting the rise and fall of races and civilizations. WoW achieves what it does because it bundles the creativity of many hundreds of collaborators, programmers, writers, social scientists, historians, visual artists, musicians, and others. Most great art is created by individuals, but WoW is a product of hundreds of creative people weaving the power of story art together with visual and sound art. WoW is an art bonanza, and these are still the early days. What will universes such as WoW be like 20 years from now? In 50? Okay, longest book quote I've ever read out loud in the history of this channel. Over. A massive franchise and a household name that never made it as big as, say, Harry Potter or Star Wars. While it is easy to pass off World of Warcraft as quote-unquote just a game, it is really a form of emergence. Our ancestors engage in emergence by passing down stories through the oral tradition in front of the campfire. These stories were oftentimes exaggerated, fantastical, and in many cases flat-out bullshit, but they were still valuable. These stories formed shared immersive experiences in which various people would travel into other worlds simply through the power of their own shared creativity. The barriers between the real world and our imagined worlds are not as distinct as we expect. Whether it's Azeroth, Middle-earth, the pantheon of the Babylonians, the Incans, or others. These don't literally exist, but they do exist as constructs of our collective consciousness. It turns out that we can individually and collectively teleport between these different worlds as we choose. The real magic is not arcane, it's creative.